All right, we're going to continue our study in George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984, looking at part 2 of that work. Last time we had a brief introduction and a study in part 1, and we saw some of the themes that would follow the plot presented there right at the outset. Interestingly, we saw right from the outset that something was not right about this world in which when the clock rung, it struck 13. So something is out of joint. Right, very first line, it was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. What we will find here is that it's just in this world of that Orwell depicts. It's not just that the clocks are out of sync with the normal notions of time, but that everything is being calibrated by the party in order to comport with the vision of reality that those in power, who are represented by the figure of Big Brother, want them to think. And they do so through various means. Various ministries also, which is sort of interesting. But these ministries will basically make right wrong and wrong right. So it's they're involved in the transvaluation of all value, with no other purpose than simply to dehumanize those that operate under their state. And this is important. So Orwell, as I said to you last time, is writing this novel in 1949, probably with Stalinist Russia and its conduct in mind, in portraying this futuristic state that would of his novel. But he seems to be thinking that it will be not just a Soviet Russian phenomenon, but something that is true of the entire world. And he has 3 discrete, I don't want to say countries, but areas of control that are operating more or less on the same principles. Now, where he is writing or operating from, Winston Smith, that is the place called Oceania, which is the English-speaking world. And they present what he calls ingsoc, English socialism. But and this presents the most powerful theme of the novel is the totalitarian nature of the government's control. There is no private and sphere in the understanding of the novel. It's not permitted. And when I say there's no private sphere, that's not speaking of private property or the family. We're going to see that also represented in Huxley's Brave New World, where the family itself is taken over, as it were, and its independence from the state is taken over by the state. That's true here as well. But the extent of the totalitarian control in Orwell's Brave New World, Orwell's 1984, extends further than that. It wishes to extend within the confines of the mind. And so there's such a thing as thought crime. And thought crime is the chief concern, I would say, of the state in 1984. They want to make it literally unthinkable to do anything other than to conform to Big Brother's demands about the nature of reality. And the nature of reality is, of course, what Big Brother says it is. And so Winston Smith is employed in the Ministry of Truth, the purpose of which is to rewrite history so that what the current demands of the party say is true is not contradicted by any other thing. And so that would literally be unthinkable for anything other than what Big Brother says to be other than what Big Brother says it is. And in this, of course, when we say totalitarian, Big Brother is effectively acting like a god that allows no freedom, in which everything is determined, and all opposition to the state's policies and actions is illegal. and considered to be treasonous, and is met with immediate and violent retribution. So all freedom, not only of assembly, of expression, is not only illegal, but literally it becomes impossible. Now, this will be in contrast to the context in which Orwell writes this novel and the context in which I am speaking to presumably most of my audience here, certainly my class, that in a democratic society, opposition groups are free to form political parties and to express their ideas freely and force those in power to address their concerns or be replaced by another party. That's the functioning premise of the Western world at present. But Orwell imagines that it is a world in which this is no longer the case. It's not only not the case, it's impossible for these things to even start off the ground. Orwell's Oceania goes far beyond what I would say is even the case in the state of Soviet communism. In Soviet communism, just like in behind the Iron Curtain in general, authoritarian leaders always seek to restrict information and control the movement of their populations and what they say and what they write. That can be policed. The Orwell's government goes beyond that, and it tries to inhibit the very thinking that would give rise to the speech. And so I would say that the focal point of the whole novel, I would say, as strange as it may seem, is around exactly this thing. It's thought control, and then and thus the crime of thought crime, and that is they being Big Brother and the party seek to monitor that by all manner of means, but things like these telescreens, which are in everyone's room and located all around it. So they're means of surveillance everywhere, such as like a monitor or a screen. It's called a telescreen. In Orwell's day, a fanciful notion probably built on the idea of a TV. But in Orwell's day, a TV broadcast information. It didn't surveil. In our day, with a smart TV, with so-called smart technology, it works both ways. And we've seen that with social media as well. So what Orwell was prophesying or using as a sort of a nightmare scenario is now already upon us. And it is what Orwell sees as a potential threat is now a real and live threat, one could say, in terms of being listened to by your television set, by your smartphone, whatever, and potentially being monitored. Now, the monitoring, the way it's presented in marketing companies, of course, is there to direct you towards things that you're already interested in. So it's to assist you. But of course, the ability to listen in on conversations could be hacked or overtaken by politicians to do exactly what Orwell envisages here. And in fact, we can find that that's already the case in communist China, where a social credit score is given in accordance with certain activities and so forth, and you are denied credit if you don't comport with the party's aims and purposes. So it's not that far off that we can imagine that what Orwell envisages as a nightmare scenario is in fact the reality operating for these totalitarian state. It goes beyond that in Orwell's rendition in terms of the dictionary that that Smith hears about, isn't working upon. He's not sufficiently intelligent to do that. He's just a minor functionary who's trying to rewrite history. As new news items come forward, they realize a contradiction in things that had happened in the past, and so they have to erase those and rewrite them using the vocabulary of the Newspeak dictionary. And the Newspeak dictionary is invented by the state specifically to make independent thought impossible, because the words will no longer exist that would suggest an alternative to the party's way of looking at things. Just in the way that Smith's little apartment is dominated by this enormous two-way television screen, and it crowds him into a corner where he believes that it can't see him and he has some sort of privacy. So those telescreens almost become symbolic of the thought control which the state is really seeking to exert. Now, interestingly, on that front, this idea of a corner where you can escape the guise or the gaze and the control of the state is central to, I think, the drama of the plot of 1984, because we immediately perceive, I would say, at the outset of 1984, the idea that this is a dehumanizing place where Winston Smith lives. And as creatures who experience freedom and value freedom, we are with Winston Smith and wishing the suffocating totalitarian state to be overthrown, and willing along with him that there might be what he calls the brotherhood, a form of resistance that will overthrow this tyranny. And so when he early on gets this diary, he purchases this diary, and he starts writing things that are clearly, to use the state's from the state's vantage point, blasphemous and certainly seditious and treasonous. We are with him in this rebellion. We see it as something that is defensible, not only from his point of view, but from every human point of view. So I think Orwell goes beyond the sort of dehumanization which we start to see already, and we have seen already in the novels that we've looked at, going, say, ranging all the way back from A Modest Proposal all the way up through Heart of Darkness, and through into 1984. We could have added other writers, which we have not yet, like Franz Kafka, who again portrays the same sort of dehumanization taking place through bureaucracy, through the extent of the state and its involvement in bettering people's lives, and in fact making them into little other than numbers, statistics. So that portrait of a growing dehumanization through the growth of power to the state is presented at its real apex here in 1984, I would say. Because at this point now, are they not only dehumanized, that dehumanization extends to the point of making thinking impossible. And so something really interesting, I think, arises in this portrait, which I think is important for us to address, and in particular as a Christian institution. Because what it comes down to in all of these phenomena, going back, as I say again, to A Modest Proposal, all the way up to this present point, is what does it mean to be a human being? And when, and how are we, how is the threat to human nature being manifested in the fiction of the day? And why do we find the fiction of the day not only plausible, but entirely accurate in its portrait of dehumanization? Why would it be dehumanizing? What is essential to human nature that we think is under threat in the expansions of the state, which is there purportedly for the common good? What's the problem there? Well, I think we then have to raise the questions about what human nature is. And my understanding of this, and probably the best pithy way of understanding human nature, is simply to see us as being made in the image of God, as presented in Genesis. In imago Dei, in the image of God created he man, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So the personhood of the human being, bearing the image of God, God being in his nature tri-personal, is represented in Christian theology in the form of the human person who bears that same image and has an integrity by virtue of the fact that he or she bears the image of God. Well, what does that entail? Well, one of the things it entails is that God in his nature is not bound by necessity. God is not required to do anything. He is sovereign. We, by virtue of the fact that we are his creatures, don't have the degree of sovereignty that he does. After all, we are created beings. We're finite as well, and we're dependent upon him furthermore. Nonetheless, the freedom that characterizes God's activity also characterizes human activity in its distinctive humanity. We have freedom to do certain things that the animals and the plants and other forms of life simply do not. They don't have that fundamental freedom which characterizes their actions. They can choose to do this or choose not to do that, and they do so not necessarily even out of necessity or compulsion, but even for no purpose whatsoever. Or they can do it simply for the purpose of beauty or joy or love. And that's central here, I think. And it's a focus in Milton's Paradise Lost, which we saw early on in the semester, that Adam was formed free, and free he must remain, says God, until he enthralls himself, which he then, of course, does, and brings down and causes his expulsion from paradise. But that freedom which characterizes his actions is a consequence of the fact that he is formed by God and for God, and furthermore in his image. Well, all of those things, and of course, when God creates, what is his motivation for doing so? Well, it's not a necessity. There's no need in God. There's no compulsion for God to do what he does. God is characterized by love. And that idea of love is also, I would say, central, even though it's not explicitly addressed by Orwell in this. In my critique of Orwell's 1984, or which is not a critique in the sense of I'm negative about it, but in my understanding of it, love is really the thing that the party is seeking to eradicate in every form, because love is connected with freedom. Love is the choice, not of compulsion, to adore someone else. And that choice to do this is free. And God makes it clear that this, in Paradise Lost, at any rate, that this is the reason why man was formed free, because mankind could not give God love if he had no choice but to do that. For that reason, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was given as a test to whether he freely chose God or chose not to love God, and that free choice was there. And the nature of sin was simply to love something good other than God as the ultimate good. And when Adam sinned and chose to disobey, of course, that was then lost. Still, the love that motivated that is understood in Christian theology from Scripture onwards, but certainly in Augustinian theology, to be the main motivation for personal action. We want to adore things. We're made to adore things. The Heidelberg Catechism puts it that the great comfort in life and death is that we are not our own, but belong, body and soul, to our Lord Jesus Christ. And the first, I think the first tenet of the Westminster Catechism is that the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. So there's a teleology to human actions, and ultimately that controls all of our conduct. And that's the case with Winston Smith as well. It is noteworthy that Winston Smith does not believe in God. So this isn't some sort of, Orwell's not presenting a sort of a Christian understanding or a Christian protagonist railing against the state. He is, however, presenting a human being who experiences all of the conditions of humanity and recognizes freedom as one of the essential aspects of that. And this is what prompts his rebellion against this suffocating totalitarian conformism, which he not only experiences, but also applies to other people through his occupation in the ministry of truth. But he seeks to evade it. And he evades it chiefly by this, at least initially, by purchasing this diary in a little old shop, which as it turns out was probably the way in which he got ensnared to begin with. He bought this diary on beautiful old paper and then wrote his opposition to Big Brother. And we were immediately drawn to his side as a hero for doing so. Not only because of his rebellion, but more because of the rectitude of his rebellion. We sense a moral principle being upheld by Winston Smith in the face of enormous odds. So that's the drama of 1984, is the way in which we are drawn to Winston Smith's side. We admire his tenacious spirit, his holding on to something fundamentally human, even while others around him conform to that state and seemingly will betray one another. And they do so frequently in a most horrific fashion. So we see children handing in their parents to the thought police for thought crimes and so forth, and of course having them executed. We see parents doing the same to their children. We see colleagues betraying one another, everyone, in other words, distrusting one another, and looking over their shoulders and effectively terrorized into conformity everywhere they turn. And it's interesting that when I lived in Germany at the end of the Cold War, and I lived with a fellow who was training to be a surgeon, who grew up in East Germany, he told me that, first of all, things that were not as terrible as they were presented in the West. But it was horrifying at that point to, and it came out that the Stasi, which was the East German secret police, had kept archives recording the betrayals that were taking place, not only of neighbors towards one another, but of families, children, betraying their parents, exposing them to the Stasi. And as it turned out, there were not that many secret police working for the Stasi. There simply were not. But they had the control that they did because everyone believed that they were omnipresent, that they did have the sort of reach which rendered privacy and free thought impossible. And that sense of their strength was reinforced by conformity. It was precisely the willingness of people out of fear, usually, to cooperate with the Stasi, believing if I didn't inform on my parents might inform on me. That's what allowed the regime to be so powerful and corrosive of good relations within families. So these Stasi archives were opened up, and people were scandalized. If you want to watch an interesting movie about this, there's a German film called The Lives of Others. That's how it was translated into English at any rate, a few decades back, which I thought was brilliant in its portrait of this. But it is an Orwellian universe that's being portrayed. And what is, again, particularly wanting to be eradicated is not just the rebellion, but the very possibility of a rebellion. And the possibility of a rebellion can only exist if there is a semblance of freedom, however small, however minute. And the place in which this exists is within the confines of the mind. Thus, and hence the reason why the Ministry of Truth wants to exercise thought control. And hence the reason why this dictionary keeps on appearing in 1984 called Newspeak, to rewrite the English language and reduce it to the fewest words possible. And what it's seeking to do is get rid of old speak. Now, the year that's given for this, the end point of this project is 2050. But what it wants to do is eradicate feelings that are opposed to the party, and all anti-party feelings and all ability to disagree. So we keep changing the vocabulary, and not only changing the vocabulary in what we might see as progress, it's evolution for words to change, but reducing the number of words as well. We want to reduce the vocabulary because every reduction allows for greater control on the part of the party and its organs of power. Now, there are 4 of these chiefly, by the way. There's the Ministry of Truth, where Winston Smith works. There's the Ministry of Love, which, so the Ministry of Truth is there for propaganda. In other words, for promotion of falsehood. So everything is upside down, topsy-turvy in Brave New World, or 1984. In the Ministry of Love, law and order is pursued, and people are arrested there and taken there and punished there. So in the Ministry of Love, you are tortured. It's referred to within the novel as the place with no darkness. That may sound great, but it's because the lights are always on. You're there, you're tortured and reformed, and then eventually killed under the bright lights of the thought police. You are rehabilitated. So light has connotations normally in English, ever since scripture, of a positive thing, of illumination, connection with truth. Here, the light is that of an inquisition, and where no dark places, nothing hidden from the thought police can be allowed to exist. The third is the Ministry of Peace. Well, this is the Ministry of War, effectively. And then finally, there's the Ministry of Plenty, which is the World of Economic Affairs, or the Ministry of Economic Affairs. It effectively deals with the rationing of food and other things that are a consequence of the terrible party conduct. So it has 4 abbreviations. So the Ministry of Truth is Mini True, the Ministry of Love is Mini Love, the Ministry of Peace is Mini Pax, and the Ministry of Plenty is Mini Plenty. Okay, so these 4 ministries are there, and they enforce the party slogans: war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. All of these things are taking place. Now, when we left off last time, we left off with Winston Smith at the end of part 1, wanting to know how not just how things work, but wanting to know why the Big Brother did what he did. It made no sense to him. It was clear, it was apparent how it happened. It was basically through distorting reality, rewriting history such that things that happened in the past were said to be non-events. They no longer happened, and their language comported with that view of reality. So that's how it happened. What he did not understand, he simply could not fathom, was why Big Brother did what he did, because and the party that was surrounding Big Brother did what they did, because it didn't seem to make any sense. Life was inferior as a consequence of it. The world seemed to be a place that was worse and worse. Rather than plenty, they were suffering terrible deprivation. They had no such things as real chocolate or coffee or anything of the sort. The propaganda stated that it was a bounty, it was a bumper crop year, and they were going to be given, because of their terrific successes of the ministry, more than they had before, when in fact Winston Smith knew that life had been getting ever worse, and that rations were getting ever shorter in supply. So he understood how they were doing it. They were simply making reality conform with their dictates. So the thought police were very effective in this. What he did not understand was why. Why did Big Brother do this? And I'm not going to give away the answer there. It arises in part 3. We will get it in part 3, part 3, but for today we're looking at part 2. But we concluded part 1 with, again, the words of the mottos of Oceania coming back to him. And I'll just read the concluding paragraph here. He tried with a little more success than before to summon up the image of O'Brien. O'Brien is a man that he has said that they would meet in a place where there is no darkness. Smith, because of his conformity to the old way of thinking, thought that this was wonderful and that O'Brien was on his side, probably a part of the Brotherhood, seeking to bring in enlightenment and truth into this horrific darkness, not realizing that it meant that they would see one another in the ministry of truth. But he said, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." O'Brien had said to him, "Wonderful." He knew what it meant, or thought he knew. The place where there is no darkness was the imagined future, which one would never see, but which by foreknowledge one could mystically share in. So he's a bit of a romantic, as Winston Smith. But with a voice from the telescreen nagging at his ears, he could not follow the train of thought further. He put a cigarette in his mouth. Half the tobacco promptly fell out into his tongue, a bitter dust which was difficult to spit out again. The face of Big Brother swam into his mind, displacing that of O'Brien. Just as he had done a few days earlier, he slid a coin out of his pocket and looked at it. The face gazed up at him, heavy, calm, protecting. But what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache? Like a leaden knell, the words came back at him. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. And so the first part concludes with, again, Smith hanging on to the hope that he has a commilitone, a partner in arms in O'Brien, who has optimism about the future, a future which would not be as terrible and oppressive as the present. That's what he believes he has found in O'Brien, and he wishes upon this. O'Brien, or rather Winston Smith, is a bit of a dreamer, and we indulge with him in those dreams. We also wish that reality were other than the one in which he is suffering. Part 2 begins, and it's a very different, part of a 3-part drama, really. The plot machinery moves on in this 3-part structure. And what it does, it introduces the figure of Julia. Now, Julia we've met already. And Smith saw her in a couple of occasions and thought that she was a part of the thought police and was probably trying to betray him, because remember, he has at this point taken the diary and written things in it. And so he thinks that she is an agent of the thought police, and he contemplates stoving her skull in with a stone, like murdering her. And so at this point, she's a figure that we're not sympathetic towards, what we find, however, is that she is someone like him. She is a rebel, and she comes up to him and falls over in front of him. This is how part 2 begins. Chap 1, she falls over. And they were 4 meters apart when the girl stumbled and fell almost flat on her face. A sharp cry of pain was wrung out of her. She must have fallen right on the injured arm. Winston stopped short. He's moved by human compassion. These sorts of things are going to be drummed out of him, among other things. But the girl had fallen to her knees. Her face had turned a milky yellow color, against which her mouth stood out redder than ever. The red is a symbol of desire, or at least a symbol of desire. Her eyes were fixed on his with an appealing expression that looked more like fear than pain. A curious emotion stirred in Winston's heart. In front of him was an enemy who was trying to kill him. In front of him also was a human creature in pain, and perhaps with a broken bone. Already he had instinctively started forward to help her. In the moment when he had seen her fall on the bandaged arm, it had been as though he felt the pain in his own body. A fellow human being, a connection, a human connection. This is the thing that Smith still has, which makes us like him so much. You're hurt, he said. It's nothing, my arm. I'll be all right in a second. She spoke as though her heart were fluttering. She had certainly turned very pale. You haven't broken anything? No, I'm all right. It hurt for a moment, that's all. She held out her free hand to him and he helped her up. She'd regained some of her color and appeared very much better. It's nothing, she repeated shortly. I only gave my wrist a bit of a bang. Thanks, comrade. And with that, she walked on in the direction in which she'd been going, as briskly as though it had really been nothing. The whole incident could not have taken as much as half a minute. Not to let one's feelings appear in one's face was a habit that had acquired the status of an instinct. And in any case, they'd been standing straight in front of a telescreen when the thing happened. Nevertheless, it had been very difficult not to betray a momentary surprise. For in the 2 or 3 seconds while he was helping her up, the girl had slipped something into his hand. There was no question that she had done it intentionally. It was something small and flat. As he passed through the lavatory door, he transferred it to his pocket and felt it with the tips of his fingers. It was a scrap of paper folded into a square. Obviously a message on it. He goes down and he is terrified to even look at the message at this point. But he sits for a while and he imagines what it might be. And he imagines that it is a message from the thought police in his terror, in his conditioning. He is conditioned, as we've seen everyone is, to be terrified at all possibilities that their private sphere is going to be invaded by the public sphere, which is now all-encompassing, where the mere thought of rebellion is going to be squelched. But then he goes and reads it, and what does he read in it but the 3 words, I love you. And he can't fathom this. For several seconds, he was too stunned even to throw the incriminating thing into the memory hole. When he did so, although he knew very well the danger of showing too much interest, he could not resist reading it once again, just to make sure that the words were really there. For the rest of the morning, it was very difficult to work. What was even worse than having to focus his mind on a series of niggling jobs was the need to conceal his agitation from the telescreen. He felt as though a fire were burning in his belly. Lunch in the hot, crowded, noise-filled canteen was torment. He'd hoped to be alone for a while during the lunch hour, but as bad luck would have it, the imbecile Parsons flopped down beside him, the tang of his sweat almost defeating the tinny smell of stew, and kept up a stream of talk about the preparations for Hate Week. So this is the beginning of the 2nd chapter, when Julia slips a piece of paper very cleverly into Winston's hand and dispels his paranoia, and from thence commence a love affair. When I say a love affair, maybe that's putting too much on it. It becomes quite clear that the affair is motivated simply by rebelliousness. It's not that Julia has never had lovers. She comes to betray to him that she's had countless lovers in the past, that she's in fact what in previous times would have been called a scarlet woman. Very much so. This is a further attraction to Winston Smith, not because I think that he loves corruption so much, but rather that it's an evidence of freedom, a freedom to do something for good and holy reasons, or the averse, to do so for completely corrupt reasons. And that is the case here. So he particularly loves Julia because she does it out of a spirit of rebelliousness. Anything that smacks of rebellion against the authority is something that Winston Smith loves. What becomes clear, though, as time goes by, is that their motivations for rebellion are rather different. Winston is more of an idealist and does want to and has political motivations. He does want to see Big Brother overthrown. He is interested in the brotherhood, and he's very much interested in recovering the past. and to attach himself to a reality other than that which is being presented to him through the newspeak of Big Brother. So he wants to understand the world, and he believes that it does make sense, and that he wants to prove that that what is being called truth is in fact falsehood. Whereas Julia, as Winston says of her, is only a rebel below the waist, and she is very happy to agree to this. So she's not an ideologue or anything. She is just almost like a child, motivated by that. And what Orwell does is he uses the two as almost foils for one another, and he compares their various political philosophies and the means of the resistance. So Julia is not really interested in overthrowing Big Brother. She just wants to be left alone. She will say, I will act in accordance with Big Brother's dictums. In fact, I will appear the most supportive party member possible. I'll appear to acquiesce to it while finding ways of getting around it and avoiding and evading it. So she's going to be deceitful in her conduct. And whereas Winston wants more than that, he understands the need for evasion. That's just self-preservation, but he wants to do something with it so that the future is no longer as terrible as the present. And the key to that is connection with the past. And so he keeps on finding ways to try and figure out what happened in the past. So I think this is really interesting and important. And what he's doing here is doing something that's important to Orwell himself, which is understanding the truth. It's not of interest to Julia, quite frankly. She has no interest in knowing what happened in the past or what the truth was. But Orwell is interested in this. What is the true nature of reality, and how do we live in that reality? We don't just want to live as if we were animals and had no understanding of the world. We want to have a clear knowledge of reality and to live in the light of that. And so the recovery of history is part of Winston's desires. And so he comes to various individuals. In particular, he comes to the character that owns the shop where he bought his journal, Mr. Charrington, and Charrington, as it turns out, who's a kindly old man, eventually rents him out a private room and sells him some interesting antiquities. And what's interesting about one of those antiquities, which I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but I think is very interesting and probably worthy of attention. One of them is a big paperweight made of glass, and inside that is a piece of coral. It's pink, it's beautiful, seemingly purposeless. Winston Smith finds it beautiful, probably because it is purposeless. And because it seems to thereby evade, again, the conformism of the party and Big Brother. But Mr. Charrington rents him this this place. He's right in the middle of the district, by the way, where the proles operate. And Smith believes that he simply has no interest in the ways of Big Brother and so forth. And is more or less indifferent from that, and he lets his guard down. What is probably the case, as it turns out, is that Charrington is a member of the thought police, and the moment at which Winston bought the diary, right at the outset of the novel, was the moment that the thought police were on to him and were following him. And so when Charrington sells him his room, or rents to him his room and sells him various trinkets, they're already well on to Winston Smith and are tracking him, and eventually they're going to close ranks upon him, and he is going to end up in the ministry of love, being tortured in the place where there is no darkness. That is the place where there is darkness, but it's of a spiritual kind. And I think the reader is well aware of the different senses of darkness and the playing upon that idea of light and darkness that I think Orwell uses so well in the novel. One what more do I want to say that about various characters? Oh, let's talk about Syme. Syme is, like Winston Smith, involved in language, but he's involved in language in a more profound way, because he's working on the latest dictionary, the latest edition of the Newspeak dictionary. He's Winston's friend, but Winston sees something different between he and Syme, insofar as Syme is too intelligent, and intelligence is itself a threat to the party. And this is really interesting on Orwell's part, because it's true that in Stalinist Russia, just like in communist China and in every communist regime, it's the intellectuals that are in the target hairs of the regime, because this makes them dangerous. His intelligence is a threat to the party, and because he's capable of thinking in a way that, other than that, the party is going to want him to think. Even though he's working for them, his very existence is a threat to them, so he will need to be eradicated. How about the character of O'Brien? We mentioned O'Brien. I mentioned the fact that O'Brien was presented to us, the readers, as a potential friend of Winston's. Well, O'Brien is a member of the inner ring. He hopes is a member of the Brotherhood. He appears at first the best possible. I mean, Winston puts all of his hopes on the figure of O'Brien. And O'Brien at first seems entirely sympathetic to us, because we see things through Winston's eyes. We'll find that O'Brien becomes central in the third part, but no, I don't want to give that away. We'll get to that next time. What happens in the third part? We will meet O'Brien more intimately and hear and find out a great deal of more about O'Brien when we come to that. Let me leave him aside for the moment. What is central in the second part is this book, a book written by the leader, the purported leader of the Brotherhood, a man by the name of Emmanuel Goldstein, leading the resistance, as it were, fomenting revolution against the party. The question that the reader has, and I'm not sure it's resolved in the book entirely, is, does Goldstein actually exist? Or is he an invention of the party? An invention that's almost like honey to trap resistors like Winston. The problem for us as readers, just like it is for Winston Smith, is we have no idea whether the resistance even exists, whether Emmanuel Goldstein even exists, or if he does exist, whether he is now one of the stool pigeons, as it were, of the party. But this lack of certainty about whether he even exists is a symbol of the way in which the party corrupts reality. It corrupts knowledge, it corrupts objectivity, and it disorients us. And so it pulls everyone into a web of confusion, in the same way we saw that Conrad admirably portrayed in Heart of Darkness. We are no longer clear in our understanding of the way in which things operate, or even reality actually acts. We don't know what happened in the past. We never get to the bottom of that, and we have no way of knowing. And this is a problem. It's one of the disorienting effects of totalitarian regimes, is that it does not allow you to imagine even, let alone to operate within a reality that would contradict what it says is reality. The conclusion, I've got a few minutes left now. The conclusion of book 2 is a little bit of a shocker and a little bit of a horror at that. It concludes with the two of them being arrested. The police burst in on Winston and Julia. They arrest them, and they reverse the optimistic tone, which had been growing throughout the novel. Remember, Winston began with his little rebellion, writing in his diary, "Down with Big Brother." And now Winston and Julia had not only found this little realm of privacy, and they've managed to meet together over months, and they've managed to find a little love nest above the shop. This belief that things could end up better now turns to tragedy, and this is why there's a tragic tone to this. There's potential comedy on the horizon in terms of the structure of the novel. It's increasingly optimistic that they might meet O'Brien, and they might, as it turns out, be able to overthrow what seems impossible to overthrow. They might just be able to do that because of the progress they're making, and suddenly that all comes down and in ashes upon them right now. And we find that with their arrest, there's a sudden and immediate downturn, and the realization that all of their hopes in an escape from Big Brother were foolish from the beginning. Mr. Charrington, who Winston had believed was a kindly old man and even potentially an ally, was actually all along a member of the thought police. And he had been being tracked probably ever since that first day. And at that point, Winston and Julia are taken to the Ministry of Love, where we will begin next class in discussing part 3 of this magnificent work. Let me conclude with a few thoughts here, because I've talked about the way in which this novel, dystopian though it is, has the note of realism about it. And I've given a couple of examples in relation to the Soviet Union and in terms of the former East Germany and so forth, and the Stasi and such forth. But there are other ways in which I think we can see 1984 to have contemporary relevance. The sense, again, the telescreens monitoring, I gave that reference as well. But all sorts of other things seem to comport with this as well. There are other things about it, though. The telescreen's an obvious thing that comes. There's also the thing called speak right. Speak right is the thing that Winston Smith uses as the copywriter in the record section. It's a recording device that converts speech into text on the telescreen, and does this immediately. And that way of using the voice to overturn the written word is becoming increasingly common in our day. And the privileging of the speech of the moment to overturn the lives and testimony of the truth of the past seems to me to be a powerful aspect of Orwell's horrific dystopian novel, the way in which contemporaries can effectively annihilate the past as if it didn't exist. Then there's all sorts of other things like versificators that produce pop music and so forth, created by artificial intelligence and so forth, creating inane tunes that are very popular with the proles. Well, that's already happening as well. There are other means there. There's the reduction of vocabulary that I could talk about. Maybe I'll speak more about that next time. But these things are of intense interest to Orwell as contemporary relevance. Again, I draw it to your attention, Politics in the English Language by Orwell, where he is talking about the same sorts of things, the debasement of language, and how it encourages totalitarian types of government and as a reduction of humanity in the process. But I'll get to that more next time when we talk about part 3. See you then.